Edge of Fate is only 1 month away, and with it, Bungie is setting new groundwork for the future of Destiny. New armor, new stats, and new weapon tiers will all be coming to the game next month. But one area of the game I think Bungie will be touching on is Fragments. I think a lot of fragments in the game are simply underpowered or don't have a place in a lot of high tier content. So I wanted to make a video breaking down what I feel are the weakest fragments on each subclass and what I would personally do to make them more viable. This includes updating any stat changes to fit with the new system. If you're unfamiliar with the new stat system, I'll be leaving a link in the description below for you to check out Bungie's article on it, because not only is it really good information to know going into Edge of Fate, but some of my fragment changes are going to rely on that knowledge. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of these fragments. Starting with the first light subclass to get the new fragment system all the way back in Witch Queen, Void. The big issue with Echo of Exchange is less about the fragment itself and more about the subclass it's on. Void is one of the worst subclasses for offensive melee abilities, with Titans having the only powered melee capable of consistent final blows in higher end content. Pocket Singularity is more of a tool designed to apply volatile and push away enemies, both of which make it harder to score a melee kill. And the Smoke Bomb on Hunter is designed to weaken and disorientate targets and rarely manages to get a kill. While Exchange does work with glaives and unpowered melees, I don't think that's enough to make it worth picking over other options. By adding an extra trigger to activate, Warlocks and Hunter melees can actually benefit from it consistently. To keep things balanced, the energy gained by the melee hit will depend on the ability itself. Shield Bash can only hit one target, so will generate the same amount of energy as a kill. Shield Throw and Pocket Singularity have the potential to hit multiple targets, so they earn half the energy per hit. And lastly, Smoke Bomb is capable of damaging entire groups multiple times, so will generate a very small amount of energy per damage tick. Echo of Leeching has the exact same issue as Echo of Exchange, requiring melee final blows to activate. I could just follow a similar solution to the previous fragment, but let's do something a bit more interesting. In order to balance this around the tick damage of Smoke Bomb and exotics like Necrotic Grips, the amount of health will be based on damage dealt to the target, and nearby teammates will get an equal amount. This allows players to build around it in more interesting ways, as exotics that improve melee damage and regeneration will pair even better with this fragment. There's not really a lot of ways to apply suppression on Void, with only a handful of abilities and exotics capable of doing so, and even then, many sources are extremely situational, or not worth trading out for other options. Not to mention, the actual reward for suppressing targets is minimal, only reloading your equipped weapon and providing a boost to one of the worst stats in the game. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's a 10-second internal cooldown, making it even more situational than it was before. Allowing Weaken to activate the fragment opens up to a lot more synergy across the subclass. If Bungie adds more consistent and varied ways to apply suppression, I'm happy to revert this back to just being one debuff. But as it stands, there's simply not enough ways to trigger it. I understand that Echo of Dilation is considered much more of a PvP fragment, but this is completely useless for PvE. I took some inspiration from the origin trait Skulking Wolf, adding essentially the same PvE functionality, but on top of that I wanted to give Dilation some passive utility. Being able to pick up orbs and ammo from a distance is pretty much always useful. The pickup distance will match one stack of Powerful Attraction at 12 meters, and would reactivate every few seconds if the player stays crouched. Echo of Vigilance also seems like a fragment designed around PvP, though unlike Dilation, it can be more useful in PvE too, though it's currently being held back by how unreliable it is to activate. Requiring a kill at critical health is a tough ask for high-end content, as you're more likely to die when you need it most. By increasing the options to activate Vigilance, it becomes better for improving survivability without making it a dominant choice in too much content. However, to stop players from using this to keep Void Overshield constantly active, I'd keep the same 8-second cooldown that was a part of the original version. And with Void out of the way, let's move on to our second light subclass and talk about Solar's Fragments. Ember of Beams might be one of the worst fragments in the game, only working with 2 supers across the entire subclass, and even then the effect is almost unnoticeable. I really can't think of a single reason to run this fragment in its current state. Giving it an additional effect that improves super damage allows us to benefit all solar supers, and by requiring multiple hits to work, it doesn't make exotics like Celestial Nighthawk any more dominant than they already are. The exact damage increase would depend on how these supers perform in the next expansion, but I think 10% is enough to make beams worth the fragment slot. It shouldn't allow either version of Golden Gun to equal Nighthawk's total damage, but should be strong enough to feel noticeable. There's not much wrong with Ember of Resolve, though I feel like it's trying to help offensive grenades compete with the viability of healing nades, and to be honest, it hasn't succeeded. I rarely see this fragment get used because the alternatives for healing are usually a lot more reliable. I think this change helps Ember of Resolve find its own place in the sandbox, especially for builds aiming to use their grenades more offensively. The amount of energy gained will depend on how many enemies are killed at once, or the higher tier the enemy is. I don't think this would be a must-have on all grenade builds, especially ones that can balance their healing and ability regeneration, but I think it might lead more people to choose this over a healing grenade in higher difficulty content. While Ember of Blistering is great for builds based around ignitions, there are already so many other options that this rarely makes the cut. And in builds that can't reliably earn ignitions, or harder content where enemies are more likely to survive, this fragment becomes completely useless. The original version of the fragment generates additional energy for defeating higher tier combatants, from 8% per kill all the way up to 25%. So for this change, the energy gained on damage would be around 3 to 5% to keep it balanced around Scorch's tick damage. This way the fragment has a place in builds that aren't based on ignitions without buffing its original usage too much. And that's it for Solar. There were already a lot of great options here, so I didn't feel the need to change too much. And now we can move on to our final light subclass and the fragments that were most recently buffed, Arc. Spark of Haste is fine, but there's not really any reason to pick it over other fragments. Most people run max resilience and high recovery by default, so giving plus 20 to these stats is often useless. Maybe this gets some use in PvP, but unless you're making up for weak armor rolls, I can't think why. With the new changes to the game's stats, Spark of Haste had to change regardless of its quality. Movement speed is no longer tied to an armor stat, so this will work as a multiplier, allowing it to stack with the speed booster buff. And by maintaining the stat boosts for a short time after sprinting, players have plenty of time to use their abilities without having to lose their bonus. Like the previous fragment, Spark of Focus isn't necessarily bad. Despite an 150% increase to class regeneration, it's difficult to pick this instead of other options. Even builds that rely on class ability, like Stormkeep Titans, can regenerate their barricade pretty fast without this fragment. Trying to balance this one was a challenge because I didn't want it to feel too close to Spark of Haste. So instead of focusing on class energy, I decided to make it another source of Amplified and Bolt Charge. Amplified is already really easy to get in combat, so earning it by sprinting feels more useful for traversal than anything else. And while there are a few ways to get Bolt Charge on Arc, I think this one is a nice option for building it up passively before a combat encounter. Spark of Instinct sounds good at first. Like a weaker version of ACD Feedback Fence, you might think this was an easy option for melee or shotgun builds. But when you start looking into the details, it all falls apart. First off, Instinct only works when you actively put yourself in danger and come close to death. And with the lack of survivability options Arc has compared to other subclasses, you'll probably die trying to activate this in the first place. This fragment also has a 15-second cooldown, so you're more likely to trigger while approaching enemies instead of when you actually need it. This is probably the biggest change I've made to a fragment so far, almost completely changing how it functions. Changing both the setup and the activation for this fragment allows players to take more consideration with how and where they use it. 3 kills within a few seconds should be enough to build up a charge, which is then automatically released when 3 or more enemies are within 8 meters of the player. I think this change justifies removing the 15-second cooldown as well. Spark of Brilliance seems like a decent choice for general crowd control in most content, but just like Suppression on Void, there's not a whole lot of ways to apply blind to enemies. Not to mention most abilities that apply blind to begin with are area of effect, so creating another blinding explosion can feel redundant. By giving Brilliance a way to apply blind to single targets, we create a lot of possibilities for the Fragment. Similar to Thread of Isolation on Strand, landing multiple precision hits within 2 seconds of each other will apply blind to that target. The reason I'm keeping it exclusive to arc and kinetic weapons is because I don't want the Fragment to become too dominant in every build, especially for stunning unstoppable champions. Spark of Volts attempts to give players easier access to Amplified and Bolt Charge through finishes. The problem is that both of these buffs are already incredibly easy to earn through other methods, so having an entire fragment dedicated to occasionally earning them feels like a waste. To give Arc more ways to apply blind, I took inspiration from Severance Enclosure to give finishers a similar explosion. Enemies caught in the blast take very little damage, but are blinded for a short period. And to keep amplified, the radius of the explosion will slightly increase when buffed. Unlike other sources of blind, the player will be immune to this specific source, because otherwise the fragment would be even more useless. Lastly, the bolt charge gain would remain at 1 stack, but increase to 2 while amplified. Spark of Feedback only needs a small change, as although the benefit of 75% increase to melee damage is incredible, having to take melee damage first is a big turnoff, especially in high-end content where tougher enemies are likely to kill you in one punch. By adding an additional way to activate the fragment, it becomes viable in a lot more content without posing an immediate risk to the player. Despite the recent buffs to Arc's Fragments, I think the subclass as a whole is still struggling to find its place within the sandbox, outside of a few very powerful builds. Hopefully these changes have the potential to give Arc builds more choice, and therefore more variety, buffing the weaker builds without making the stronger ones too overpowered. But now that the light subclasses are done, we can move on to Dark, starting with the first subclass to receive fragments, Stasis. Whisper of Fractures is a bit too situational, requiring setup before you can benefit from it. Shattering a frozen enemy with a melee isn't impossible, but it's very easy for other sources of damage to shatter them first. And all that for a single stack of frost armor just doesn't feel worth the effort. Simply removing the melee attack requirement feels like the best solution, as it creates a lot more potential for a variety of builds. For example, pairing this with a Rhyme Stealer weapon could be a really fun and effective combo. Whisper of Reversal is incredibly niche. Best case scenario, it will allow your melee or glaive to stun overload champions if you have stacks of frost armor. Worst case, it's completely useless. It applies 10 stacks of slow, which takes at least 10 hits just to freeze a target, which is completely useless for Warlock and Hunter powered melees. Withering Blade will still take 2 hits total to freeze an enemy, and Penumbra Blast instantly freezes anyway. I really couldn't see a way to buff Reversal without completely reworking it, because even buffing the amount of slow wouldn't fix all the issues I have with this fragment. Changing the benefit to a burst of slow feels like something that could work naturally in existing Stasis builds, especially if the amount of slow was more in line with Withering Blade. At 1 stack of frost armor, the cooldown to recharge this burst would be 15 seconds, dropping all the way down to 7.5 seconds at 5 stacks. And 5 seconds at 8 stacks. This allows you to combo it with Whisper of Rhyme. Most fragment descriptions are pretty accurate, even if they are just heavily simplifying the actual effects, but not Whisper of Fissures, which just lies to the player outright. Fissures does not increase the size or shatter damage like it says it does, and instead creates a second stasis explosion that not only deals a very small amount of additional damage, but also experiences damage fall-off. On average, this fragment only increases the shatter damage by around 6 to 12%. And to make things worse, the bonus explosion does not count for the same damage type as the original shatter. For example, if a stasis crystal is created by a headstone weapon, then any kills earned by shattering it will also count as a kill by that weapon. But when you have Whisper of Fissures, if that bonus explosion kills the enemy instead, it will no longer count as a weapon kill, which can negatively affect certain builds. My solution to all these problems is simple. Make the fragment do what it's meant to do, and remove the damage fall-off. That's it. 1 darkness subclass down, and now it's time to move on to the most recently added one, Strand. Thread of Binding is another fragment that doesn't do enough to stand out. Warlocks can get the same effect by consuming a Shackle Grenade with Mind Spun Invocation, and the Titan Super in general can suspend without kills. Sever is an incredibly useful debuff on Strand that reduces outgoing damage and pairs really well with Suspend. Sever always lasts longer than Suspend, so even though PvE enemies can't attack while lifted in the air, they'll still have their damage reduced for a short time after coming down. Unlike Suspend, Sever also affects boss enemies, meaning this fragment can allow something like a Shackle Grenade to reduce their damage. Spawning a Fredling can be pretty useful, but taking up a whole fragment slot just to occasionally spawn one isn't even worth it on a Fredling build, especially when there are far better ways to generate them. Having a fragment that competes with Thread of Warding feels like a good change, as right now it's the main way for most builds to gain Woven Mail. And while finishes might not be as consistent as picking up Orbs of Power, I think the additional benefit of spawning Fredlings might be enough to sway people towards using this instead, while still having a reason to combine the two together if they wanted. With only a couple fragments worth changing, I think Strand holds up really well overall. And now that it's out the way, we can move on to our sixth and final subclass, Prismatic. Facet of Hope is very easy to activate, but the benefit is minimal. It's a 40% increase to class regeneration when you have one buff, increasing up to 60% when you have 2 or more. At its highest, this is still less than half the regeneration the Spark of Focus rewarded back on Arc. Unless you are desperate to generate more class ability energy, this isn't worth picking over other options. Buffs on Prismatic are half as long as they are on other subclasses, so increasing their duration by a couple seconds at the cost of a fragment slot doesn't feel too overpowered, but does make Facet of Hope a bit more of an interesting option for builds that might rely on buffs like Radiant or Woven Mail. Facet of Devotion is okay for helping to generate light transcendence energy if you're lacking other sources, but the benefits it provides are minimal, and depending on your build, the generation can be a bit inconsistent. Currently, Devotion only gives 1 to 5% light energy based on the type of enemy killed, so doubling the bonus when your Darkness bar is maxed out gives this fragment a small boost to help you gain Transcendence more consistently. Facet of Sacrifice is basically just Facet of Devotion in reverse, only with less energy gain and easier conditions to trigger. So it only seems fair and balanced that we give this fragment the same bonus we gave the last one. Facet of Defiance is another fragment that fails to justify being picked over other options unless your build revolves around getting finishes in groups of enemies, which isn't always the best for high-end content. Giving Defiance a small benefit outside of using finishes gives more of a reason to use it in a larger variety of builds, while also creating a nice gameplay loop. Finish an enemy to spread the debuff, kill the enemies affected by it, then profit. Facet of Generosity offers zero benefit to the player using it, making it one of the worst sources for Orbs of Power in the game. Not to mention, this only works on Transcendence, making it very situational as well. Being able to generate orbs for yourself feels like an obvious buff, making this fragment worthwhile for solo players. Generosity was already capped at a maximum of 4 orbs per Transcendence, so even if this was reduced to 3 orbs to compensate for this change, I feel this fragment is a lot better. Facet of Mending is basically Prismatic's version of Ember of Resolve, granting the player cure on grenade kills. This version is at least a bit better than its solar counterpart, but in some cases has to compete with far better sources of healing too. Providing a small amount of Transcendence helps make Mending a slightly stronger pick for builds focused on becoming Transcendent, without feeling like a necessary choice for every build. Facet of Blessing is a slightly nerfed version of Echo of Leeching, providing identical effects when Transcendent. While there is a far better selection of melee abilities on Prismatic, it has the exact same issues as Facet of Mending. The best solution I could think of is both a mix of my buff for Echo of Leeching and Facet of Mending. Facet of Justice is just too situational to be worth using. Transcendence is already incredibly powerful, so a small buff to its abilities goes mostly unnoticed, even in ideal circumstances. By allowing Justice to work outside of Transcendence, I think this fragment could get a bit more use in a few builds without having too much of an effect on Prismatic stronger builds. Facet of Honor is not only a pretty negligible way to build Transcendence energy, even in builds based around elemental pickups, but it also fails to compete against other fragments designed for generating Transcendence quickly. I wanted to keep the focus on elemental pickups, but move this fragment away from Transcendence altogether, now offering a stacking bonus to the new grenade, melee, and super stats. Each stack adds plus 10 up to 3 stacks total. They last for 5 seconds, but additional pickups will reset that timer. Lastly, to balance it around their slower spawn time, tangles grant all 3 stacks when destroyed. And that's it. Every fragment in the game that I feel needs a buff in Edge of Fate, whether that be small or large. I want to reiterate that these are purely my ideas and opinions, and in no way am I expecting Bungie to make any of these changes at all, though it would be pretty cool if they copied a couple, just saying. I'm sure if I sat down with a designer at Bungie, they'd tell me a lot of these changes simply go against what they had envisioned for the subclasses, or even the design philosophy of Destiny itself. And for some of them, I can fully understand that. I can almost guarantee that there are some fragments I've probably overlooked, or even some changes where I've not fully considered the effect on the sandbox. So if you have any ideas for yourself, I would love to hear them in the comments below. Edge of Fate is getting closer and closer every day, and every week we get more and more info, so I'm looking to see if Bungie are going to do any major buffs to fragments, and what exactly that will be. And when they do, if you'd like me to cover that topic, let me know. But for now, I've got some farming to do. That unvoiced god roll isn't going to earn itself, so I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you in the next video.